Hi guys, it's Marissa here coming to you live from Rise High. You know that at Rise High we are 100% committed to having your back during this difficult, challenging time. So we're bringing you as much information as we can to help you through to ensure that you can get out the other end and have your financial situation intact and try and do as much as possible to make sure that you and your family are looked after during this time. One of the questions that we've been getting asked a lot is whether it is a good time to buy a property now, whether that be a home or an investment property. So I thought, given that it's such a popular question, we should do a live on it. And please feel free to ask questions and send comments through as we go. Happy to answer all your questions today. Hi to Giselle and Sam. Thanks for tuning in, guys. Just wanting to answer your questions today and shed some light on this. Obviously, there has been a great deal of economic impacts that have resulted as a result of this health crisis, and the economy has suffered a little bit. But the reality is that there are people still buying property, and definitely property transactions are still happening. We are still seeing banks approve loans, so it is still happening. The other thing to keep in mind is that agents are still holding opens. Even though they're not normal opens with large groups, they are still holding opens on a one-on-one basis. Before I get into some of the ins and outs about whether you should consider buying property now, I guess I want to remind you that this situation that we're currently in is a temporary situation. Australia and definitely the world have faced many different types of crises and difficult times in history, and the one thing that they all have in common is that we have always recovered, and this situation is no different. We know that the coronavirus is temporarily out of control at the moment because we currently don't have a vaccine or a immunisation against it, but that will change in time. And once we do have those health solutions to the coronavirus, then we will find that all of the economic issues that we're facing right now, all of the job losses, they too will be repaired. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that the first thing to note is that we do need to remain positive. We do need to remember that this is a temporary situation. The economy will recover. If you have suffered income loss or job loss as a result of this crisis, that is likely also to recover and hopefully repair itself after this crisis. And I guess the other thing to remember is that people will always need houses to live in. So that's another thing to keep in mind. And the other thing to really remember is that the fundamentals of property really haven't changed as a result of the coronavirus. So the fundamentals are really the demand and supply, and that is what determines whether property values will increase or decrease. So the fundamentals that drive property value growth and capital growth are still the same as they were a few months ago before the coronavirus hit us, and are likely to still be the same once the coronavirus is over. So let's talk about some positives, and I'm going to also talk about some risks that you need to be aware of and manage if you are planning to buy. And definitely feel free to throw in some comments or some questions as we go. I'm here to answer your questions today, guys. Firstly, let's discuss the positives. We have very low interest rates, which is fantastic. I mean, obviously, we've had 2 recent rate cuts, most of which has been passed on by the banks. So interest rates are at an all-time low. And from what we're seeing, it is likely that they're going to remain low for some time. So that basically means that as far as money is concerned, money is very cheap. Okay, so that's obviously going to save your costs when you buy a property. I believe that the property market's likely to remain stable through this crisis, and I guess I want to explain why I'm thinking that. I mean, we've obviously seen what this crisis has done to the share market. The share market has suffered considerably as a result of people, or as a result of emotional and fear-driven investors selling up their shares quickly. So with the share market can be very volatile based on what's happening in the media, what's happening in the news, and definitely based on fear that is surrounding our communities. And that's exactly what we're seeing in this time of crises. One thing that I love about property investment and property in general is that it is a lot less volatile. And for a risk-averse investor like myself, that gives me greater comfort that the property values aren't going to go up and down quite so drastically as shares do, and quite so suddenly. So what we could expect to see is that there will be definitely a lot more stability. The other point I want to make is that property transactions generally are quite time consuming. So it takes time to buy property, it takes time to sell property. Given that we know that the coronavirus is a temporary situation and hopefully likely to be resolved in the next 6 to 12 months at the latest, it doesn't actually make sense for people to rush into selling their homes for something that is such a short-lived situation. So what we expect to see is that people will hold on to their homes, people will hold on to their investment properties throughout this crisis. And definitely the governments, through all the government relief packages that are coming out, and the banks, by allowing homeowners and investors to have repayment holidays and put their repayments on hold, are definitely trying to do everything they can to support Australians to hold on to their property assets. All in all, this leads to my conclusion that I think that property values will remain quite stable throughout this period, and potentially may even see a bit of a lift once this is over, because what we do see in uncertain times where people have lost money on the share market or been put off by the volatility of the share market is that more investors will shift to property as an investment vehicle of choice rather than shares, because they do see comfort in that stability that property brings during times like we're seeing now. I guess the other thing is that there are some really great buying opportunities, really good rental returns. That, coupled with low interest rates like I discussed before, it does have all of the ingredients to make it a great time to buy. So definitely I think that it is a great time to buy a property, but there are some risks and there are some things that you need to be aware of. So I'm going to go through those now to protect you. Before I get started, a few shout outs: Richard, Brett, Sharon, James, Cassie. Thanks for tuning in, guys. Really appreciate it. If you've got any questions, throw them over my way. I'd love to answer them. Let's talk about some of the risks. So what we're actually seeing at the moment is that it is really important to have stability in your income if you are planning to buy a property, whether that be a home or an investment property. So at the moment we're in an uncertain time. Many people's jobs and employment is questionable, I guess, given what the next few months will entail. If you are planning to buy a new home or an investment property, it's really important that you've really thought about what the future might hold for you. And if you are concerned that your job and your employment income may be at risk, then perhaps consider whether it is the right time to buy, or whether you'd prefer to wait until you have more stability in that income situation. If you are concerned that your employment is at risk, but you do have very good savings, and you've got a very good backup plan to protect you and your family in the case that your income was either eliminated or reduced, then potentially that is something that you can still proceed with and still be comfortable buying a property. But it's really important that you have that plan in place to ensure that if you're buying a new home or a new investment property, that you can actually fund any time period where your income has reduced or been taken away from you. What we're actually seeing is that in some instances where people apply for loans, if their situations change between the time they make the application to the time of settlement, say for example they lose their job during the application process, it may be that the bank can then refuse to approve the loan. And this can sometimes even happen after the loan has been unconditionally approved. Now, if you're going through the process of purchasing a property, once you've achieved unconditional approval from the bank, you've effectively satisfied the finance clause in the contract, which converts the purchase contract into an unconditional contract. If after receiving that unconditional approval you lose your job at that point, the bank does reserve the right to withdraw the approval before settlement. And if that happens, then it can expose the purchaser to potentially losing their deposit and potentially even having to pay the vendor some compensation for not proceeding with the purchase. So it can be very costly. So one thing that we've been talking to conveyancers about is actually being able to put a clause in the purchase contract that protects the purchaser against this situation happening. So definitely, if you are planning to purchase, whether it's a home or an investment property, I really encourage you to reach out to your conveyancer or your lawyer that's reviewing your contract and ensure that they're putting a clause in the contract that will allow you to get out of the contract and get your deposit back if at any time the bank withdraws the approval for your loan. That will protect you against this situation happening. I guess for investors, we also have the added risk of the fact that the tenants might not be able to pay rent due to the situation that we have unfolding in front of us at the moment. So obviously for existing investors that already have landlord's insurance in place, they should be covered for rent default and loss of rent from the tenants. So that's great for existing investors. But if you're just looking to buy a new investment property at the moment, you might find that many of the insurance providers that were providing landlord's insurance have now stopped providing landlord's insurance or still provide landlord's insurance but are not allowing for rent default during this period of hardship. So what that means is that instead of normally you would be eligible to receive insurance for rent default, which is if your tenant stops paying rent, you can recover that from insurance. But what we're seeing at the moment is that that is not necessarily being included in new policies moving forward. What I have been told by the insurance brokers is that once this situation is over, we expect landlord insurance policies to go back to normal and you will once again be covered for rent default. Despite the fact that you might not receive rent default in the short term, I still encourage you to get landlord's insurance because it still protects you against loss of rent and also damage done by tenants. So that's still very, very important. So definitely landlord's insurance is still essential. We also have the added complexity of the government coming out and basically putting a pause on evictions, which basically means that if tenants can't pay rent or can't pay the full rent, that landlords are not allowed to legally evict them for that reason during the next 6 months. Now, there's been a lot of mistruths about this, what this actually means. And I just want to shed some light on this because I hope that this doesn't put you off from buying an investment property if every other reason stacks up that you should. Basically, the government has come out and said that landlords and tenants should work together to try and get through this period. People have misconstrued that to mean that tenants can have some rent-free time. And that is definitely not what the government intended and definitely not an accurate position of where we're at the moment. What it basically means is that if tenants are struggling because they have had a reduction of their income or they have lost their job, they can apply to their landlord for some relief. And what that relief would look like is some sort of payment plan or deferred rent payment. Not a rent reduction, not a rent-free period, but it is a deferral of rent payments. So firstly, the tenant would have to prove that they have suffered loss as a result of the coronavirus. So as the landlord, you'd expect to see evidence that they've lost their job or evidence that their hours have been reduced. Plus, you'd want to get evidence of what government relief packages they've applied for and what relief they're receiving through that avenue. You'd also want to talk to them about what they can actually afford to pay. So they may not be able to pay the full weekly rental, but maybe they can pay 70% of the weekly rental. And whatever they can't afford to pay in the short term will be accumulated as a debt for them to pay once their employment situation resumes to normal. So basically, if a tenant is signing a lease agreement and they are promising to pay a certain amount of rent, they do need to honour that lease agreement. But if in the short term they can't afford the full rental, then they can apply to the landlord to have a rent deferral. That's basically what's happening. So as a landlord, you need to be aware that if you are buying an investment property now, that is the conditions that we're buying under currently. Of course, once the coronavirus is over, things will resume to a much more normal state, but we are in an unusual situation right now. I think just all in all, if you are buying an investment property or a home to live in, make sure that the contract covers off on your purchase risks. Make sure that you've got sufficient cash reserves and surplus savings so that if you do have a time period of hardship in the future, in the coming months, and you do have an unexpected job loss or job reduction, that you can get through it without compromising too much. And definitely make sure that you stop watching a lot of the negative media. Focus on the information that is accurate. Focus on the fundamentals rather than the fear that's going through the market at the moment, and try and stay positive and look at the long-term picture, because property investing and owning a home is a long-term proposition. So you need to look beyond what is happening right now and think about your long-term future when deciding whether it's right for you, whether to buy a property or not. I guess the other thing to say, once again, I said it at the beginning, but banks are still lending money. We're getting approvals every day for purchases. So banks are still open for business. So definitely it is an option to buy a home or an investment property. If it is something that you're considering, we'd be happy to help you out with it. I am going to be running a much more detailed Facebook Live where we're going to cover off on the impact to the property market, the impact to the economy, and give you lots of tips on what you can do to make sure that you protect yours and your family's financial position through this challenging time. And I'll be running that Facebook Live together with Priya from our team on Monday, the 6th of April at 1 p.m. So I hope you can tune in with us then. It will be lots of information, really informative. It will be a good chat, and really hope you can join us for that session. Thanks so much for tuning in, guys. I hope that you're all staying safe, staying well. We're here to have your back. We're working around the clock to make sure that we can help you through any difficult challenges that you face through this period. So please reach out to us. Please let us know what we can do to help. If you have any questions, we're here for you. Thank you for your support, and we'll be here to support you through this, and together we'll get through it together. Thanks and have a great day. Bye.